The Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by C&MC, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat Commission.
Now, Sam, growing wheat in New Zealand a lot different. Let's talk about the environment. How do those growing conditions compare to Ontario?
That's a good question, Bern. I mean, New Zealand its key competitive advantage is environment. I mean, we have a temperate environment. We're surrounded by a big ocean, and effectively what that does is regulate temperature. Interesting enough, same latitude as Canada or Ontario, with winter wheat. However, with that ocean around us, we typically see temperatures only ranging from sort of maybe 5 degrees in winter and up into maybe the low 30s in summer. And by doing that, it creates a nice environment for growing, crops like winter wheat.
Yeah. Talk about the size of the market and the yields. What do growers take out of the field?
Yeah, well, the market's pretty insignificant. It's quite small, but we do grow big yields. And, so we're talking around about 135,000 acres. We're probably across the board averaging more or less 120 bushels per acre. And, dare I say it, we do have our extremes. We do have a world record.
I was going to say 245 bushels, Eric Watson. I mean, you can't take that away, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great feat, awesome yield, massive. I think something that will be very difficult to obviously replicate, but never say never, because I'm sure it will happen at some point. I know there's people up in the Northern Hemisphere in the UK who are obviously always gunning for that world record too, to hold the cup. So, and there'll be other farmers also within New Zealand who are looking to try to replicate, the feat that Eric's done. So,
let's talk about how he does it and how growers in New Zealand do it. You really talked about in your presentation today, that connection between genetics and agronomy.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at it, it's a synergistic effect. We need to constantly evolve and push the envelope. When I think about growing a good wheat crop, genetics forms the base. Understanding and actually driving basically yield comes from selecting the right variety for the right environment or conditions, and then looking to optimize that through management. And that starts at obviously sowing. So when we look at the planting date to suit that variety, obviously the earlier we can go within reason is generally better, because that sets us up for more yield potential. Then when I think about the other bit, it's around management. It comes back to initially fertility. So it's thinking about what sort of input are we trying to put in to get to certain goals.
Let's talk about that season. It's a long season, right? Not a lot of highs and lows in the weather. Talk about that, and I guess planting rate as well,
yeah.
Sam.
Yeah, well, actually, that's one thing, Bern. Actually, when I moved to Canada a year ago, I was thinking about seeding rates and whatnot, and I was getting all these numbers thrown at me of 1.8 million seeds per acre, 2.2 even, and obviously that increasing as the season or the planting date got later. In New Zealand, we're much less. We're early season 125 per hectare, so rough math, that puts us at, I'm guessing, about 50 per acre. And then as the season, we get later into tail end of autumn into winter, we're more into increasing up into 150, 200 seeds per square metre. So per square foot, you divide that by 10. So we're moving from about 12 per square foot up to about 15, maybe 20. And the reason for that is because we have a warmer environment, particularly during winter, we see a longer period of tillering. And it's that tillering which is offsetting that sowing rate. So, where we possibly are trying to compensate that, or definitely are compensating that here in Canada, we're getting more tillers through effectively the warmer growth.
Let's talk about headcount. My colleague and your friend, Peter Johnson, always likes to talk about headcount.
Yeah.
He's asking Ontario growers to really, really dial it in. Talk about headcount in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's important. The challenge I put to my colleagues was, I think there was there's the old information out of the 80s, I believe it was, around, that winter survival and the amount of seeds per foot of row that are required. And my initial challenge was, well, that's great, it gives you a starting point, but really what does that mean? Because I could be looking at an individual plant with one stem versus an individual plant with 3 stems, or 1 stem and the 2 tillers. And when I think about that, all of a sudden, what does that lead to? It's basically determining, how many heads you're going to have per square foot. And general rule of thumb back home, we'd be wanting, somewhere in the vicinity of around 70 per square foot or 700 per square metre. And nice talking to Peter actually, because I'm pretty sure that he and I are on the same page that at the bare minimum you want 50 here in Ontario, and 60 is good, 70 I think is great, but that does bring other complications once we start bringing up those head numbers.
Let's talk about fungicides. Let's talk about plant health, Sam.
Yeah.
You mentioned in your presentation, maybe 2 passes, 2 applications, even up to 5. Talk about what drives that decision in New Zealand.
Yeah, it's all about inputs, right? So, initially setting the expectation of what it is you're trying to achieve. So, is it a 10-tonne crop per hectare? Is it 13? Is it 14? Is it the world record? And then understanding what's required to get there. So, once we've gone through variety and we've dialed up our fertility, then, the next cab off the rank is to obviously manage green leaf retention. And obviously fungicides play a really important role in that. And, we all know the flag leaf is the most important leaf when driving yield in winter wheat. However, if you have a dense crop and some of these diseases come in before flag, we actually need to manage the disease prior to flag. So, we typically have seen the adoption out of the UK now of introducing, we have T1, we have T2, so GS32, GS39. We obviously have our heading spray to it, T3, but now we also have a T0, which is kind of like a post-winter tidy-up. Septoria for us back in New Zealand is a big challenge. And so as a result, that typical spray window is, or number of applications rather, is getting bigger. The environment's conducive for disease. The payoff for using fungicides is great because we've already started growing a crop or setting a crop up initially with, optimal sowing date or timing, putting the nitrogen in or committing to that nitrogen or fertiliser, and then we need to obviously address the other limiting factor, which is effectively that green leaf retention. And the longer we can do that, the higher the end result.
Final question for you. You've been in the Northern Hemisphere now a couple of years.
Yeah.
Think about New Zealand. Think about what you've seen here in Ontario and Canada the last couple of years. What can we learn from growers and wheat producers in New Zealand?
Yeah, that's a good question. Look, I think for the most part, Canadian growers do a great job. What I would say is that, and this season is testament to it, I think planting date is really, really key. And I know that, you can sit there and do return on investments, etc. And if you look at it by crop, you might find that the beans are kind of edging in and pushing that wheat further back. But, I suppose the challenge is to actually look at the overall system in terms of, your corn, your beans and your wheat in a rotation and what it's actually bringing to that. The fields around, yep, there's definitely been some winter kill. There's no doubt about it. It's been horrific this year, right? However, in saying that, there are also, fields out there that look excellent. We've had a cooler, wetter spring. Those fields that actually got in early enough that we're able to establish, get through that challenging winter, and through that wet spring, they actually look really good. And I wouldn't be surprised if we saw some really good yields out of it. So for me, I think one of the key things would be planting date. The other thing would be that, look at the overall program. If you're wanting to dip the toe in more fertility, then you also need to look at, using other tools in the toolbox, and that being fungicides, and also then further afield, thinking about those PGRs that are coming into the market too.
Yes, plant growth regulators. We'll talk about those on another episode, sir. Thank you for stopping by. Appreciate the time.
No problem. Thank you.